Most people will not stay here for long, and that is not a mistake in the message. It is the design of it. This is not content built to compete for attention, to entertain, or to reward impatience. It operates quietly, and quiet things make the unprepared uncomfortable. Already, some feel the urge to scroll, to check something else, to look for a faster signal. That impulse is not random. It is the nervous system reacting to the absence of stimulation it has learned to depend on. If you are still listening, it is because something in you recognizes that this is not noise. Awareness does not announce itself loudly. It reveals itself through stillness, and stillness feels foreign to a mind trained to constantly consume. This is why most people leave early, not because they disagree, but because staying requires a kind of presence they are no longer practiced in holding. This message does not ask you to believe anything. It does not promise reward. It does not rush toward a conclusion. It simply creates a space and observes who remains inside it. Those who do are not forcing discipline or chasing meaning. They are responding naturally to coherence. And that response cannot be faked. If you're here, it's because part of you already knows that the real signal isn't found in what comes next, but in your ability to remain. What most people call being awake is usually just another identity layered on top of old patterns. It is a label, a story, something the mind uses to feel elevated or secure. But real wakefulness is quieter than that. It doesn't announce itself, and it doesn't seek agreement. It shows up as a shift in how you relate to experience itself. An awake mind is not constantly reaching for stimulation, reassurance, or resolution. It can remain with what is happening without needing to escape it. And that capacity is far rarer than people realize. Modern conditioning has trained attention to fragment. From the moment awareness appears, it is pulled outward, toward screens, opinions, urgency, comparison. Depth becomes uncomfortable, not because it is heavy, but because it is unfamiliar. Stillness feels like absence when you've been taught that value only exists in movement. This is why most people confuse awakening with excitement, visions, or emotional intensity. Those experiences feel active and validating. Presence does not. Presence feels neutral at first, almost empty. And the untrained mind interprets that emptiness as boredom or loss. To be awake is to notice this impulse without obeying it, not suppressing it, not judging it, just seeing it clearly. The urge to leave, to skim, to look for the point, these are not personal flaws, they are reflexes. Conditioned responses designed to keep the system in motion so it never has to settle. Awakening begins the moment you stop mistaking those reflexes for truth. The moment you realize that discomfort does not mean danger, and silence does not mean nothing is happening. This is why sustained attention has become a dividing line. Not intelligence, not belief, not even curiosity. Attention. The ability to remain present without needing constant novelty is now a form of perception most people have lost access to. They can think deeply, feel intensely, argue convincingly, but they cannot stay. And staying is where awareness stabilizes. Not in the peak, but in the pause after it. If you are still here, it does not mean you are special. It means your system has already begun to reorganize around coherence rather than stimulation. You may have noticed this in other areas of your life. A growing intolerance for noise. A lack of interest in conversations that loop without insight. A desire for fewer words, fewer explanations, fewer distractions. This is not withdrawal. It is refinement, awareness shedding what it no longer needs to maintain clarity. Being awake also means you no longer need to be convinced. Messages either resonate or they don't. You're not trying to extract meaning from this. You're allowing meaning to register on its own. That is a critical distinction. The awake mind does not hunt for answers. It recognizes alignment when it appears, and alignment feels subtle, not dramatic. It feels like something settling into place rather than something breaking open. This is why so few people will stay until the end. Not because the message becomes more complex, but because it becomes less demanding of the mind and more demanding of presence. There is nothing to do here, nothing to agree with, nothing to take notes on. And for a system trained to equate effort with value, that can feel threatening. The ego wants tasks, milestones, conclusions. Awareness does not. Awareness simply remains. If you've made it this far, it's not because you forced yourself, it's because you weren't pulled away. And that absence of pull is the signal. It suggests that somewhere beneath thought, beneath identity, beneath conditioning, something in you is already awake enough to recognize when nothing needs to happen. And that recognition is not the result of learning. It is the result of remembering. There is a specific moment that arrives for almost everyone who listens this far, and it is easy to miss if you don't know what to look for. It doesn't announce itself as a test, yet it functions as one. The mind begins to search for resolution. It wants the message to reveal its purpose, to justify the time spent, to deliver something it can grasp and store. This impulse feels reasonable, even intelligent. But it is also the exact point where most people disconnect without realizing it. At this stage, attention is no longer challenged by difficulty, but by simplicity. Nothing new is being introduced. The pace slows, the language becomes less stimulating. And suddenly the question arises, why am I still here? Not spoken aloud, but felt. This is the threshold. The moment when awareness is invited to remain without being rewarded. And for a system conditioned to associate value with output, this feels subtly uncomfortable. What's happening beneath the surface is not boredom. It is exposure. Without constant stimulation, the mind becomes aware of itself, of its habits, of its need to move, label, and conclude. That self-awareness creates friction. The easiest way to resolve it is to leave, to switch tasks, to scroll, to seek something more engaging. Most people interpret that impulse as intuition. It isn't. It is conditioning, attempting to restore equilibrium. Staying through this moment requires no effort, but it does require honesty. Not the performative kind, but the quiet recognition of what is actually happening inside. You begin to notice how often your attention abandons experience the moment it stops being entertaining. You see how quickly the mind reaches for control when it feels unoccupied. And in seeing this, something loosens, not dramatically, just enough to create space. This is where the message begins to work differently. Not as information, but as a mirror. You are no longer listening for content. You are listening to your own reactions to the absence of it. And this is uncomfortable because it removes the illusion that distraction is a personal choice. You see that it is automatic, learned, predictable. And once seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. Those who stay are not proving discipline or spiritual strength. They are simply not interfering with the process. They are allowing the discomfort to exist without immediately resolving it. And that allowance is transformative in a way effort never is. The nervous system begins to settle, not because it is being forced to calm, but because it is no longer being constantly pulled outward. This is also the moment when separation falls away. You may notice that the voice delivering this message no longer feels external. Not because you agree with it, but because it is articulating something you are already observing in yourself. The boundary between speaker and listener softens. There is no persuasion happening here, only recognition. For many, this is the point where the urge to leave becomes strongest. Because staying now means relinquishing the familiar role of the seeker, the analyzer, the consumer. It means remaining without an agenda, and that feels like loss to an identity built on doing. But what is actually being lost is not you, it is the compulsion to fill every space. If you remain through this threshold, something subtle but irreversible occurs. Attention stops chasing the message and starts resting within itself. Time feels slightly different, not slower or faster, but less important. And in that shift, you are no longer waiting for the message to end. You are simply present with it. This is not the reward. It is the reorientation. And once it happens, the rest unfolds without effort. When you stay beyond the point where most attention collapses, something begins to reorganize quietly beneath thought. There is no announcement, no sensation that demands interpretation. What changes first is not your understanding, but your relationship to effort. You may notice that you are no longer waiting for something to happen. The urge to extract meaning softens. The mind, having exhausted its strategies for control, loosens its grip. And in that loosening, perception widens without trying to. This is where people often expect transformation to feel dramatic. Instead, it feels ordinary, almost too ordinary to acknowledge. The nervous system, no longer overstimulated, begins to recalibrate on its own. Breathing deepens slightly. Muscular tension releases without instruction. Attention stops jumping ahead and settles where it is. Not because you decided to focus, but because there is nothing pulling you away. This is coherence. And coherence is quiet. Staying through the message does not give you new information. It removes interference. Layers of internal noise that once felt necessary simply fall away. You may realize that clarity was never missing. It was obscured by constant motion. When motion stops, clarity doesn't arrive. It reveals itself as what has always been present underneath. This is why the shift feels less like becoming something new and more like returning to something familiar you forgot you knew. As this settling continues, perception becomes less reactive. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer demand immediate response. Emotions still move, but they pass without gripping. You begin to experience space between stimulus and reaction, and that space changes everything. Not because it gives you control, but because it dissolves the illusion that control was ever required. Awareness does not need to manage experience to remain intact. This is also where many realize that the feeling they once called isolation was actually misalignment. When you move from this stabilized awareness, you are less inclined to feel silence, less interested in performing certainty, less willing to engage in exchanges that exist only to maintain identity. This can feel like distance at first, but it is not withdrawal, it is precision. You are no longer leaking attention into places that cannot receive it. Nothing about this state is exclusive or elevated. It does not make you better, wiser, or separate. In fact, it removes the need for those distinctions entirely. Comparison loses relevance. Urgency dissolves. The need to be seen or validated fades because presence no longer requires confirmation. You are not holding on to this state. You are simply not disrupting it. This is the quiet outcome of staying. Not enlightenment, not answers, but stability. A grounded clarity that does not fluctuate with input. From here, action becomes cleaner because it is no longer driven by restlessness. Speech becomes more deliberate because silence is no longer threatening. Even confusion, when it arises, is met without panic. It is allowed to resolve itself in its own time. What changes when you stay is not the world. It is the interface through which you experience it. And that interface, once stabilized, does not easily revert. You may return to noise, to activity, to complexity, but something remains different. You know now what it feels like to not be pulled, and that knowledge is not conceptual. It is embodied. This is why the transformation does not need to be reinforced or repeated. Once attention has rested in itself, it recognizes the path back without instruction. The message has already done its work by stepping out of the way. What remains is not something you carry forward. It is something you stop leaving behind. By the time you reach the end, something important has already been revealed, not through explanation, but through absence. There is no final statement waiting to complete the experience, no conclusion designed to resolve what you've been listening for. And this is intentional, because awareness does not move in straight lines or arrive at destinations. It stabilizes when the need for arrival dissolves. The ending you might expect was never the point. The fact that you are still here is. Most messages train attention to anticipate closure, a summary, a call to action, a sense of completion that allows the mind to disengage cleanly. But this message resists that structure because awakening does not conform to it. If it did, it would simply become another object the mind could collect and move on from. Instead, what remains at the end is space. And space is unfamiliar to a system accustomed to being filled. This is where the deepest shift occurs, not while listening, but in what happens when nothing more is being offered. You may notice a slight impulse to seek something else immediately, to replace this stillness with input. Or you may notice the opposite, a reluctance to break the quiet. Neither reaction needs to be interpreted. They are simply indicators of how your system relates to openness when it is no longer guided. The message ends, but the state does not. And that distinction matters, because what you've experienced is not dependent on these words. They were only a stabilizing reference, a gentle boundary that allowed attention to rest long enough to recognize itself. Once that recognition occurs, the container can dissolve without collapse. Awareness does not require support once it has remembered its own stability. This is why there is nothing to take with you from this, no practice, no belief, no identity. Anything you try to carry forward becomes effort again, and effort reintroduces tension. What remains is not something you do, it is something you notice when you stop doing. The simplicity of that is often underestimated, but it is precisely what makes it durable. You may return to your day and find that nothing appears different. Conversations will continue, tasks will need attention. The world will remain complex, but the way attention meets those experiences may feel subtly altered, less reactive, less rushed, less fragmented, not because you are maintaining a state, but because you've seen what happens when you don't interrupt one. This is also why this message does not ask you to share it, repeat it, or return to it. Repetition is unnecessary once recognition has occurred. If you come back, it will not be to recreate the experience, but to notice what has already changed. And if you don't, nothing is lost. Awareness does not depend on reinforcement. The reason only the awake stay until the end is not because staying creates awakening. It is because awakening recognizes when nothing more is required, and that recognition is quiet, unremarkable, and deeply sufficient. There is no signal announcing it, no feeling of completion, just a subtle knowing that the search, at least for now, has paused. This is where the message truly ends, not in sound or silence, but in your ability to leave without feeling like you're missing something. When that happens, the transmission has completed itself, not by adding anything to you, but by revealing what was already present once you stopped reaching for more.